Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into today's story, I have a quick question for all of you. I've been thinking about when to upload our next thrilling tale, and I want your input. Let me know in the comments if you'd prefer to hear these stories weekly or if you'd like me to post them daily. Your feedback will help me decide how often to share these eerie encounters. So, make sure to comment below and let me know what you'd prefer. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into today's story. I used to go hiking here and there. About a year ago, I went on a trail that led into the middle of the woods. The area I live in is a bit out in the country, and there are a lot of good places to hike. This was my first time on this particular trail. As I started, everything seemed fine. There appeared to be nobody else around at all. There were no cars in the parking lot, and as I began hiking, I neither saw nor heard anyone. I hiked for about 30 minutes and eventually reached a section in the middle of really thick woods on both sides. As I walked down the path, I remember hearing a noise ahead, just inside the woods. It was pretty far off, but I stopped to look. Of course, I figured it was probably an animal of some kind. Moments later, instead of an animal, a man appeared on the path. He had long, straight hair and a mustache. He walked out to the middle of the path, sort of faced me, but didn't seem to be looking directly at me. Then he just stood there. I continued to stand where I was, too. After the man didn't move for a few moments, I actually thought about turning around and heading back. It just seemed really weird to me. But then I decided I would just keep going and walk right past him. As I approached the man, who was still standing in the center of the path, he started to look at me and just stared. When I got really close to him, I waved and said hi. The man didn't respond or wave back. When I reached him, I tried to go around, but he stepped in front of me. The guy asked me where I was going, and I said I was just walking on the trail. As soon as the man started talking, he seemed a bit off, like maybe he was on drugs or something. He was acting pretty sketchy and then told me to follow him. I said, no thanks, and decided I would just walk back. I told him I really had to get going, and the man said, okay. So I turned around and started to walk back. The man just stood in the same spot for a while. Then I heard some noises just inside the woods along the trail. When I turned around, I saw the man walking back into the woods. I was glad to be getting away from him because he seemed very strange, and I didn't know what he was doing. So I was just going to walk back to my car in the parking lot. But a couple of minutes later, I heard a noise pretty far behind me on the trail. I turned around and noticed that the man was now walking on the trail behind me. He was pretty far back, but I saw that he was carrying what looked like a large stick. I tried to walk a little faster and kept going. As I did my best to ignore the man. I could sort of hear him walking a ways back, so I would know if he was getting closer. About 5 minutes later, the man was still there, walking on the trail behind me. But shortly after, I stopped hearing him. I felt better and thought he must have finally left. But then, a few minutes later, I heard him again. He was still following me. The longer this went on, the more nervous I became. Without really trying, I was now walking extremely fast. It seemed like the man was keeping up with me, but he wasn't really getting any closer, which was good. This continued for what felt like a very long time. At last, I could see the beginning of the trail and the parking lot. I got out my keys as I approached, and when I reached the parking lot, I looked back again. The man was still there. I quickly unlocked my car, got inside, and then locked it. As I was driving away, I looked back and saw the man reach the parking lot. He watched me drive away, and I was really glad to be getting out of there. I ended up reporting the guy for following me and his sketchy behavior. I didn't want another hiker to encounter him. After that experience, I haven't been back to that trail. I don't really know who the man was, how he got to the park, or what he was doing. It was really strange for him to follow me all that distance. This happened when I was much younger. I was around 12 years old or so. I remember that when I was growing up, we had a house with a really big backyard. It was so large that there were several acres of dense woods beyond our little open area. We would often have all kinds of wild animals pass through the backyard, but by far the kind we saw the most were deer. I would also go out into the backyard all the time because I was a pretty active kid and enjoyed being outdoors. However, I didn't go very far into the woods much because it was so dense and large that it would be easy to get lost, and we didn't have actual paths back there. One evening, I was out in the backyard waiting to be called in for dinner. The sun was almost setting, and I remember hearing a noise at the edge of the woods. I looked over and saw a deer standing there. We made eye contact for a moment. The deer stared at me for several seconds before finally turning and moving back farther into the woods. I wanted to see where it was going, so I followed the deer a little bit. I got to the edge of the woods and saw the deer maybe 50 feet farther in, and then I noticed that there was another one. I started to walk farther and farther into the woods. I was trying to be careful not to startle the deer anymore, but they seemed to be moving farther away from me anyway. I ended up going pretty deep into the woods. The deer had completely disappeared, but I was still trying to see them. Eventually, I gave up and started to head back. By now, I was pretty far out and was surrounded by trees. Plus, it was getting pretty dark outside. As I was making my way back, though, I heard another sound coming from behind me. Figuring that it was another deer, I turned around and looked. I saw a bush being moved about 30 or 40 feet away from me. I thought that it had to be an animal, but the split second I saw the bush moving, it didn't look like it. I kept watching and then saw a man come out from behind the bush and then go behind a tree. I didn't get a real good look at him, but it was enough to tell that I didn't know the man. He appeared to be some random guy and was not one of the neighbors. Nobody was supposed to be in our yard, so this was really strange. Immediately, I felt the need to go back to the house as fast as possible, but for some reason, I just stood there and kept looking directly at the guy. I think I was just in disbelief. After a moment or two, the man came out from behind the tree. He was looking right at me and then started to walk in my direction. I turned and started sprinting back to the house. I probably ran as fast as I ever had before. I did not bother to look back and see where the man was at this point. Soon, I was luckily able to make it back to the open part of our backyard. I kept running and then made it to the house and went inside. I locked the door and then quickly found my parents. I told them about the guy, and we then looked out of all the windows. The man was nowhere in sight, he must have stayed in the woods. My dad then went outside to look around and even went a short way into the woods. He came back and said that he didn't hear anything, and even called out asking if anybody was there. He also didn't see the man and said that the guy must have left, probably realizing that he shouldn't be here. I felt much better knowing that I was safe inside. The rest of the night was fine, and I went to bed around the time that I usually did. However, before I fell asleep, I was lying in my bed, and I had my window open a crack to get some cool air inside. I heard the wind and the sound of crickets, but then I heard another sound. It was somebody walking out in the yard pretty close to my window. I looked over and at first saw nothing. But then a man came into view, the same man who I'd seen in the woods earlier. He started walking right up to my window. Somehow, I had the awareness to quickly run over and shut the window and lock it. The man literally walked right in front of my face on the other side and looked at me. It was a terrifying moment, but I'm so glad that I closed the window. Then I bolted out of the room. Luckily, my parents were still awake and in the living room. I told them about the guy. They came into my bedroom, but the man was gone by then. Once more, my dad went outside into the yard, except this time we called the police as well. They came out and did a search of the property but couldn't cover the entire woods because it was pretty large. The man was able to get away. I slept with my lights on and windows covered for weeks, but luckily, the man never came back and I never saw him again. Thinking about that experience still gives me the creeps. I'm really glad that I was able to close my window in time, though. This happened a couple of years ago. One of my good friends is a guy named Drew. We grew up together and have been friends since we were kids. At the time of this story, Drew had just recently gotten married to his wife, Jennifer. After they got married, they bought a house a little out in the country. It wasn't too far away, maybe 20 minutes from the city, but it was farther out than either of us had ever lived. Both of us grew up in much more populated areas. They wanted more space, and the property had a really big yard, much of which was wooded. I remember that shortly after moving there, Drew invited me out to his place to check it out. When I arrived, I was very impressed. They still had to get more furniture since it was a much bigger house than the apartment they had before. The yard was especially cool because the house wasn't close to any neighbors, and the woods were quite large. There were paths in the woods, but they hadn't been maintained in many years. Some paths were okay, while others were completely overgrown with tall grass and other plants. Drew wanted to show me the woods, so we walked out there. He said his plan was to buy a couple of four-wheelers and restore the paths so he could drive through the woods. It seemed cool to me, and we went out to investigate the condition of the paths and mark off areas that needed clearing. We ended up going pretty far out. I didn't realize just how big the woods were. We had been walking for quite a while, and by this point, the paths were very overgrown. That's when I first noticed someone else out there. I randomly looked over to the left and saw a man walking a far distance away. He seemed to be just walking through the middle of the forest. This struck me as really odd. I asked Drew if there were any neighbors' properties nearby. He said no, and that their property was the only one on the street with a large woods. I told him I saw a man walking in the distance. By now, the guy was out of sight. I had only seen him for a moment before he disappeared. Drew said that nobody should be out here, and he was 100% sure this was his land. We walked a little ways back to try to see where the man had gone, but we had no luck. The guy was far away, and there were many trees and bushes in between us. Drew called out, asking if anybody was there, but got no response. We both hoped that maybe it was a neighbor who had somehow wandered into his yard. Honestly, we had no clue, but we knew the guy wasn't supposed to be there. I thought the guy would leave when he realized we were out in the woods, so we continued finding and marking off the path locations. About 20 minutes later, as we rounded a corner, we heard a noise behind us. We both looked back and saw the man. He crossed the path from one wooded area to another. He was probably almost 100 feet away. When we saw him, he quickly disappeared into the dense woods. Drew yelled at him, saying this was private property and that he needed to leave. We got to the location on the path where the man had crossed and looked into the woods where he had gone. The man never replied to Drew, and we no longer saw or heard any sign of him. He would have had enough time to get a good distance away by then. Drew yelled one more time, saying that if he saw him again, he would call the cops. After that, we continued on, but by this point, we were both very suspicious of the man. We wrapped up and decided to head back to Drew's house. We were probably at least a 15-minute walk from getting out of the woods. About 10 minutes later, when we were maybe 5 minutes from being out of the woods, there was another noise behind us. We looked back, and the man was there again. This time, he came out of the woods onto the path and was walking towards us. Drew and I both just took off running. For some reason, I had a feeling this guy was dangerous. Clearly, he wasn't listening to Drew and wasn't bothered by the threat of the police. We ran all the way out of the woods and into the rest of Drew's yard, then went inside, and Drew called the police. When the cops arrived at his property, they searched a bit of the woods, but the man was never found. Somehow, he had managed to elude them. I went home after that and was honestly glad I didn't live there. I kept in touch with Drew, and he updated me on things. He said the man never returned, at least not that he was aware of. Drew still lives there with Jennifer, and I've been to their house several times since. He was able to complete the pass for his four-wheelers in the woods. Luckily, he hasn't seen the man at all. We never found out who the guy was or what he was doing in the woods.